Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jeff Ando. I'm Director of Content and Production at Global Trade Review, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this trade-focused virtual session at ACT International Treasury Week. We've got a great lineup of experts eager to share their expertise during this next hour. They will introduce themselves when we get into the discussion. You can also view their bios on the event platform. Please do use the Q&A function. I'm sure I've been told to do at various points during this week. We'll go through your questions towards the end of the session. We should also be using some polling, allowing those watching to have their say. By way of introduction to this discussion, I think it's become apparent that the current health and economic crises will change the way the world does business in the future, with treasurers and other practitioners needing to plan and support how they adapt to the new normal. We're getting into some of the key issues around trade, from political disputes to supply chain issues to potential changes to future trade agreements. My first question is to Rebecca Harding, who is our first speaker. Rebecca is CEO of Coriolis Technologies and a renowned economist and author. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Rebecca, where are we in the geopolitics of this new normal? And indeed, how different is that to the old normal? Has much actually changed?
I think the most straightforward answer to that is to say it's geopolitics and politics as normal. So what's driving the agenda at the moment geopolitically? Is it COVID or is it tensions with China, between the US and China? I think it's quite obvious to see both of those things are very important. But what's been really interesting about all of this is, first of all, from a geopolitical point of view, it's still geopolitics as normal. We're seeing conflicts across the world. They haven't gone down in number at all. So conflicts and insurgencies across some of the conflict-ridden parts of the world are still there. But more than that, we've almost seen the weaponization of the pandemic, if you like. So Donald Trump has used the COVID crisis to say, well, we're going to use tariffs for a lack of transparency on behalf of China in terms of their reaction to the COVID-19 crisis, where it may have originated. The other really important thing about this isn't just the international side of this, it's the fact that Donald Trump is playing to his domestic audience. And we can begin to see more of this type of weaponization of the pandemic internally, using China as almost, if you like, the bouncing ground for all of this. Because what Donald Trump wants to do is make the point that China wasn't transparent. This has become a global pandemic. There are all sorts of issues with the economy which now need to be brought back to America and brought home again. So it's the America First agenda. Now, this has massive consequences for trade, and the big consequence that it has for trade is, of course, around the multilateral organizations and the multinational organizations to do with trade. Now, if you look at the World Health Organization, which obviously isn't a trade organization, but if you look at the World Health Organization, it's been politicized by this crisis, by the removal of funding by the United States. And we've seen Robert Azevedo, the head of the WTO, resign today, not as a result of COVID, but as a result of underlying political pressures and tensions between the US and China, and whether or not the World Trade Organization will actually be an appropriate structure in this post-pandemic situation. So I think there's a whole load of things which are geopolitics and politics as usual. COVID has just become another weapon in the armory, if you like. And the reason why we're seeing this now is because we're seeing shifting spheres of influence. And I think that's the important point to end this question with, really. We're seeing shifting spheres of influence around the world because of changes in trade power, changes in economic power, changes in technological power, and the dominance of the US dollar fighting against all of those shifting sands, if you like. There's an awful lot of trade and economic power in China, and technological power as well. And it's that, in a way, that means that trade is being used as a proxy in a much broader geopolitical and geostrategic conflict. Jeff, I can't hear you.
Sorry, thank you, Rebecca. I think a lot of the pre-pandemic uncertainty in trade centered around China, whether it was trade war tariffs, rising operating costs, or concerns about what some have termed to be techno-nationalism. Do you think we're going to see big changes in how people deal with China going forward? And before Rebecca answers this question, I'd like those tuning in to go to the first polling question, which asks that very question. Do you expect changes in the way companies manage their inventory and in their strategic approach towards markets like China? And the answers are yes, no, and difficult to predict for those who prefer to sit on the fence. We're going to give Rebecca a couple of minutes to give us her thoughts, and after that we'll come back and see what you all say. But Rebecca, do you want to offer some viewpoints on this area?
Certainly, and I think the answer is that from a political perspective, absolutely, relations with China are going to change. They may in the end change for the better, but in the near term, as I said earlier, we've seen this almost weaponization of the pandemic that's been going on. The immediate reaction of Donald Trump's economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, was to say, we need to bring jobs back to America. We can't be dependent on China anymore. And we need to make sure that America's first in everything, completely bringing the debate back home. Now, the impact that has on trade and the impact that has on America's allies is that Donald Trump and his administration have used trade coercively as a means of achieving their objectives towards China. So tariffs and the weapons of trade, if you like, are used in order to achieve those objectives strategically by the United States. So what it means is if the UK wants to have some kind of a trade deal with the United States, ultimately there is a chance that it will have to come into line with US thinking on China. In other words, do less business, for example, with Huawei. You've already seen after the phase one deal was struck between the United States and China, you've already seen the State Department impose restrictions on the amount of buying of Chinese technology and also of selling US technology into China. So there's already a lot of constraints there. So you can expect the US to use its tariffs, its trade agreements, its trade negotiations to achieve its strategic objectives. So at a political level, absolutely, this is a risk. But if you look at this from a business perspective and look at this from a banking perspective, actually, China is an incredibly important market, and we're being naive if we think that we can just shut China out. We can't, and China's an incredibly important market and always will be. And there are opportunities on both sides, and the multilateral argument that banks and corporates would want to put together around all of this is that they can continue to do business. But what we're likely to see is a change in the way corporates and banks do business with China. So there'll be more subsidiaries, there'll be more joint ventures, and potentially as well, less use of the US dollar and more use of alternative currencies in order to do trade with China.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for that, Rebecca. I'm just going to quickly look at the polling results that have been coming in. It seems that everyone's pretty unanimous in their view on changes in the way. We've got yes coming in at a whopping 85%. So I think that's a no is 10% and difficult to predict is 5%. So a small number of people are not prepared to put their neck out there, but I think most people are saying that things are going to change. So are you surprised at those findings, Rebecca, or do you feel it's inevitable in many ways?
Well, it's a relief to have got the answer to that exam question right in the eyes of the audience, but
yes,
but absolutely, I think everybody can see the writing on the wall. If we're talking about a new normal is going to include a changed relationship with China. Now, as I said, in Europe, that doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. We just have to be very wary of the fact that there will be consequences from our relationships with the United States as well. So there are a lot of imponderables out there at the moment. It's going to be difficult, but this is almost the inevitable end game from the tensions that have been arising, and it's almost COVID has almost concertinaed all of that paradigm shift, if you like, that's been digital technology into a few weeks.
Yeah, it does seem like in many ways a lot of the things that we're already aware of have just been accelerated, like so many things. The COVID seems to be an accelerant to other issues around trade in so many different areas. I guess before we hear from some of the other speakers, Rebecca, one more for you. The issue of those supply chains, would you expect many changes to what we know as the just-in-time inventory model? I know areas like food, medicine, things like medical equipment, and dare I say PPE have been areas that the supply chains and how far they are from home that's been called into question. Do you expect to see changes to that just-in-time inventory model?
Absolutely. So, I mean, again, back to the political point or geopolitical point, the first thing is that nation states have been incredibly nationalistic about those supply chains, particularly in key sectors. So 93 countries have imposed export restrictions on associated equipment, medical equipment. Only 2 countries have actually liberalised their markets, Germany and India. So there has been a big political element to all of this. That obviously has meant that banks and businesses have had to rethink, and procurement officers have had to rethink where they're getting this stuff from. But globally, that just-in-time inventory system, as I said earlier, it's been a huge risk for countries because they've been very dependent on China. What we're likely to see is more nodes all the way around the world, where you see little pockets of inventory. But the fundamental business model of globalization is not going to change. So why are we seeing all of this? Why are we actually seeing this sort of paradigm conflict, if you like? The rules of trade are these. First of all, you trade with other countries because some countries can do things better than you can. That's a basic rule of trade. So you trade because it's a good thing. You can do something well, the other country can't, so you trade. The way that's morphed through the process of globalization is that you actually trade because some countries make you more productive than others. So there are actually ways in which you can be more effective. That's become very cost driven as well. So you've had, total inventory stock reliance on, say, one country. What we're now going to see is an almost network advantage beginning to come through. So how you manage your networks and your nodes all the way around the world is going to be how you've got to manage supply chains. And that means you'll keep smaller stock, but in more places.
It's very interesting. Thank you, Rebecca. I think that brings us a good chance to bring Winnie in. Winnie is Winnie Lee, Group Treasurer at PPD Global. This is, of course, International Treasury Week, so good to hear from a treasurer on these themes. Winnie, you're a treasurer tasked with managing risks, as all are. I see your role is very much a global one, sitting in the UK, but covering over 40 countries. That includes North and South America and Asia. So I guess as a starting point, and welcome, what practical advice would you offer on managing those supply chain shocks and potential disruption on behalf of a global company, and how can treasurers best prepare themselves?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And then indeed, maybe just quickly let people know what PPD do, so then people have a context of what we're actually working on, how we operate globally. So PPD is actually an organization of we call CRO, so Contract Research Organization. So we actually provide comprehensive and medicine development and laboratory work, for big pharmas and biotech companies developing various different drugs. So you can imagine that we actually working in 47 countries and got 25,000 employees across the globe. So there are lots of, logistic issues and then, how we operate across the various different regions. And then my role is although I'm sitting in UK, but very much I'm in a global role, and it's very exciting. And then during this pandemic, and then PPD continues working on, solutions for various different illnesses and diseases. Despite the fact, number of different hospitals had to shut down or change to be more COVID-19 driven, we're still doing that. And the PPD is very much on the front line in terms of working with the big pharma and biotech companies developing treatments for COVID-19 as well as vaccines. So which is very exciting. We actually been extremely busy with trying to help the humankind to find a solution to the issues we have for all of us, really. So even just for example, that, PPD even actually planned and deployed, testing all our frontline employees with COVID-19 related tests, making sure they're actually working in a very secure and safe environment to actually develop, the solution for everybody. So I think with that context, you will appreciate, as Jeff and Rebecca just mentioned, one of the hot topics is the PPE, and we have that issue. Literally, the lucky thing is the PPD actually already operating in China. So we have many operations, various different locations in China. We were able to very quickly, utilize our very solid, vendor relationship in China and try to secure the PPE locally. And the one major issue we had, just refer to what Rebecca mentioned, was actually the logistic. How to bring the China's PPE out of China and how to actually distribute to different locations across the world for people to be able to utilize them for our vaccine development or treatment development, or continue to actually solution for existing diseases and so on and so forth. That was quite some work. So our procurement director, treasury, and everyone's been working together, try to provide a solution. One thing we find, as I say, the government policy for importing, exporting PPE keep on changing. They put in restrictions, but every week we find the restrictions either has become more tighter, sometimes be even looser. So we find the different ways and utilize different, shall we say, policies being implemented. We did manage to secure PPE to provide sufficient suppliers to our employees, and then which is I guess is because we have a good distribution channel, as well as actually the relationship with the local vendor was good, and also the logistics side we've been managing very well. And on top of that, we also actually seeking other solutions, like we'll refer to, Rebecca mentioned, we have to try to find the solutions outside China as well. So for example, we literally managed to get cloth masks for all the employees across the world, 25,000 employees. Everyone have a PPD logo cloth mask and prepare for us to go back to work. So that is actually trying to make sure that you're looking for something on top of the norm. So utilize your existing relationship, but also looking at what is actually outside a new relationship in different countries and so on. And those cloth masks was produced in the US, so the distribution of that was much more easier in comparison. And also I guess the tightness of the restriction was getting better and better as well. So that helped us. In terms of a practical advice as a treasurer, I would say definitely, work with your procurement director, looking at various different, supply chains out there, which might not be what you currently use, but look at the alternative source of suppliers, and obviously making sure the quality is as good as what you normally, accept. And then, build some more relationships, and considering, supplier from different locations. Don't just thinking, let's say people always say China is a big factory for the world, but then you also need to think about other solutions outside. And then maybe also looking at, the cash forecast in terms of how you actually making sure your cash going to the location to secure certain, goods you normally don't use, and or increasing use requirements, and how you're doing that, and then forecasting that and making sure you have a plan for it. Also, building lots of, maybe ad hoc funding requirements, how to deal with that. For example, how you actually get cash into a location complying with the transfer pricing, policy you have in the company, and then seek for different payment methods as well. Very much, interesting is you will find actually because the PPE crisis, we had lots of payment methods, people accept different payment methods than your traditional normal banking transactions. So you have to be more flexible, thinking of different solutions. And then also think about different currency, restricted currency, how to deal with those type of issues. Maybe think about non-banking solutions, so on and so forth. I think those is actually, very practical, different things we considered and explored. Thanks, Jeff.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Winnie, and very practical advice. I think we've actually got quite a few questions coming in already over the Q&A. Please do keep referring to those and submitting your questions. We'll get into those at the end. And it's very helpful guidance Winnie's offering for the many Treasury professionals that are watching this. We've had a lot of talk about business continuity planning, Winnie. What are the different options you feel Treasury should consider when it comes to taking those necessary steps to preserve their liquidity?
Yeah, I mean, this is we all heard about during this week and being the Treasury Week, number of different business continuity models, different organization building. And then PBD is really no different to other organizations. We consider many, many different options. And then what I would say here is actually not necessarily what exactly PBD implemented. Some are, and some is actually the options we explored and decided not to take up, or some's taking up. But I thought it's actually just working through the different sort, the thought processes and giving people some recommendations. So certainly, one thing is very different, maybe very different to some organizations. In PBD, the Treasury Group also manage the credit control function. So we actually have the pleasure to manage the cash in and all the way to cash out, everything in between, and also the debt and the investor relations, so on and so forth. So it's very, quite broad in PBD, the Treasury definition, I would say. And then obviously Treasury is also customer facing function. So which is actually make it very easy and then to think about liquidity, how to preserve cash and so on. So first step we did is actually we divided the focus and then energy in different work streams. The first work stream is on the cash inflow. So literally looking at the credit, function, and then looking at, together working with business development group and also operational team, we actually very detailed and combing through every single clients we have and looking at all their projects and then looking at what, this COVID-19 related impact for different business, revenue streams, and what is actually the scenarios and the hypotheses regarding different studies. Some of the studies, obviously involving the employees going into the hospital, we call sites, and actually conducting various different research and discussing things with patients. But obviously, it's, given the circumstances, things have to be changed. And then the COVID-19 related studies really booming up, and how we actually do those studies, in a secure environment, so on and so forth, and how that impacted the cash inflow. So that's actually lots of work, being done there. And then also working with procurement and inventory and looking through, how much stock we truly need, and what's, what is the essential stock we need, whether we need actually think about more than just in time inventory. And also thinking about, where to get them, and then, maybe the costs, throughout the pandemic, the cost of PPE obviously increased, and it's not normal anymore. So we have to be very adaptable in terms of how to, facilitate, providing the fund for making those, secure those stock and so on and so forth. And the stock level will need to be changed for compared to what it used to be. And then cash outflow, the third work stream, we're looking at, all our vendors and then looking into the non-essential spend and essential spend. Certain countries, you might actually prefer to pay things early to make sure that, the certain, services and also certain costs is generated, but certain countries and certain product lines, you were thinking maybe you can renegotiate with a vendor regarding credit terms, so on and so forth. So that's, the third work stream. The fourth work stream is actually we done a lot of studies on the government assisted program. Throughout the pandemic, everyone saw different governments actually come up with various different interesting incentive programs, and some is defer over tax payments, some is actually literally give you incentive cash bonus for you to keep your employee still hired, employed in the organization, so on and so forth. Different government is different. So we actually done lots of, analysis there, giving PPDs a very, been working very well. We're actually a very strong company. We are not having any issues in terms of our cash flow, but we want to make sure that we examine where is relevant to PPD and what is actually is useful for PPD. We definitely would want to claim anything which is actually saying you have a liquidity issue, but we certainly examine where opportunities are presented in any country where it's actually we can actually utilize as again for the cash flow for the company. And then the fifth work stream is a more technical treasury side as well. Most of the people probably look into similar things that PPD already considered. We look at our whole finance structure, our debt structure, and looking into the various different sources of funds, and then we actually can utilize, making sure we have got good liquidity around the organization. Even we don't need the cash, but we actually utilize our revolver to make sure that in very sufficient cash can be going around the organization. And also we actually looked into AR securitization if we need to deploy those. We look at also what many different working capital related synergies, and then also different tools and the factoring program out there. And I've been working with many different banks, explore different options and doing cost and benefit analysis on those. And also we considered equipment, sell on a buyback program, and then looking at whether it's actually something worth to do. And then also, as I mentioned, some kind of non-banking solutions as well. A good thing is actually some of the banks are very good. They actually, right from the beginning of the pandemic, they actually work, talking to PPD and, literally try to present what the options are there and so on and so forth. So some of them, obviously PPD did not take up, but for everyone else, for different organization, I think, work with your existing relationship and just be really flexible, and then be very open and think about all sorts of solutions and do the cost benefit analysis and seek the solution suitable for your organization. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Winnie. So obviously very useful practical advice for our many treasurers watching, and we'll be coming back to some of those with Winnie shortly. Slight change of pace here. We're going to bring Sam in. Sam is Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform. It feels like in the world of trade, a lot of the conversations are around turbulence, around issues that require a lot of change, a lot of things that people need to respond to. Sam, I see your work is primarily on trade policy issues with focus on customs, regulatory barriers, along with that dreaded B word Brexit, much as it feels strange to return to that. It does seem that the UK government remains committed to pushing ahead with Brexit. Coming back to those business continuity planning issues, can the UK's exporters and indeed the wider economy really cope with new barriers to trade when so many businesses are said to be on their knees?
Well, I think if you take the government's statements at face value, they're going to have to be. Is the unfortunate response, in that the government is saying that they do not want to extend the transition period past the end of the year. The deadline for making that decision is July the 1st. And I would caveat what the government has said so far with the comment that if Boris Johnson were to change his mind, he would happily, because he thought it was in his interest to do so, he would happily do so. So there is still a possibility that he will stand up on television and say, well, because of COVID-19, we're going to extend the transition. Sorry about what I said before, but hopefully you all understand. And to be honest, I think most people would understand. I don't actually think that would cause him any political problems, but that's not what they're saying at the moment. And I suppose the point I would make beyond that is it then becomes a question of, can an arrangement with the EU be concluded and brought into effect by the end of the year? The answer is that would be very difficult, not impossible, but difficult. But from a business planning perspective, the argument I would make is that it doesn't really matter whether there's a trade agreement at the end of the year or not, because the ambition for that trade agreement is quite low. From if you look at what the proposal is, we're looking at a trade agreement that at best will remove all duties and quotas, but otherwise businesses will be asked to deal with import-export declarations, regulatory checks, particularly on products of animal origin. If you're a services provider and you want to continue to service clients across the EU, crudely speaking, it's difficult to speak across the entire services sector, but you're probably going to have to set up a presence within the EU to do so, and you've got to start worrying about the movement of your people across borders. This is all true whether there's an agreement or not. So January 1st, 2021 is going to come with a massive shock, whether there's a deal or not. And to be honest, it makes sense for companies to prepare as if there isn't going to be one, because if there is, there will be some small upside, but you won't have actually wasted too much money.
Okay, that's very interesting. On the basis that Brexit does proceed, a bit of a leap of faith there, how easy do you think it is to actually conclude the new free trade agreements in the current climate that the UK will be clinging to as offering, you know, the solution to that? Things like Zoom calls and virtual platforms, much as we've been on one for this week, does that really cut it when going into tough negotiations? And also, I suppose, as a follow-on point from that, have we seen changes to the soft power dynamic following the pandemic? Are those countries that seem to have performed better in dealing with this crisis going to have more credit in the bank than those that have maybe perhaps struggled a bit more?
So on the technical question, does negotiating over Zoom make things more tricky? Yes, of course it does. But we can see that the UK is ploughing ahead with that. It does. So I was informed recently that we did actually conclude one of the rollover agreements with the Andean community largely on Zoom in the past. So we do have some recent experience of actually concluding an agreement on Zoom. But of course, going into the negotiation with the EU is tricky, and we're also in parallel negotiating with the US over Zoom, with the first round of negotiations set to conclude tomorrow. My point on the Brexit negotiations, though, is that we know what the fundamental roadblocks are. So at the moment, it's debate over fishing rights, it's disagreements over what the EU called the level playing field conditions, so how much the UK should be bound to UK rules on environment, labour, state aid. And then also there's other smaller disagreements all over the place, including the structure of the agreement, and also on issues such as rules of origin, for example, where the UK wants a bespoke model, the EU wants to pull something off the shelf. So, but on the major issues, are these technically difficult things to work out? No. What is required is political leadership. If there is to be a deal by the end of the year, it's because the UK will have budged a lot on its red lines and the EU will have budged a little. And it's just a question as to whether we can ever get into a political space where Boris Johnson is able to make those concessions, and also where the EU is able to concede in the areas it needs to as well. And I think this goes to your broader point of the current climate, which is everyone's distracted. My argument in favour of transition extension is largely that we shouldn't be thinking about Brexit now. We have a pandemic to deal with, which will be followed by recession. I think we might discuss later how that will hit, but it's going to be all of the impact of that is also going to be asymmetric. Different countries are going to feel different things at different times. There's going to be mismatches of supply and demand. People are going to be reeling and businesses are going to be struggling. Let's not talk about Brexit right now. Of course, I like talking about it because that's why people invite me onto things like this. But realistically, we shouldn't be asking businesses to do so. And it would make sense in my mind to extend the transition for at least a year. But the government isn't listening to me at the moment. The British government isn't listening to me at the moment.
Back to the issue of supply chains that Rebecca touched on, where do you stand on the view that companies should relocate their supply chains closer to home? This concept of nearshoring we've heard so much about. Do you think that would mitigate some of the risks we've heard about when it comes to those essential goods and products, you know, food, PPE, medicine, etc.? Would that be of assistance?
So I don't really think so. And this is a really crude sort of analogy. But if your factory burns down and you only are buying from one factory, it doesn't matter if that factory is in China or the UK. You still have a problem. So just saying, well, we'll do everything at home creates a similar issue to if you do everything in one other country. I think a more sensible approach is to look at actually where the vulnerabilities are. And I think what we'll actually see is actually global trade has held up fairly well throughout the pandemic so far. I think there are more shocks to come, but it's been okay in terms of getting hold of things. But there have been a few specific issues. So to give one, the UK buys nearly all of its paracetamol from India. And then India put in place export restrictions on paracetamol. The UK actually came quite close to running out of paracetamol. So what are the solutions here? One is that, well, we could have stockpiled a load more paracetamol. That's not a bad one. And another is that, well, we should make sure that we're not only buying paracetamol from India. A third is to have arrangements in place with India to ensure that if they do put in place export restrictions in the future, they do not apply to the UK. So I think there are lots of routes we can go down, and I do think governments are going to try and go down the forced reshoring route to a degree. It's certainly happening in the US, it'll happen in the EU a little bit, but I'm not sure the UK would actually be successful at doing that, even if it tried, because it's just not a big enough market compared to the other groups that will be trying to do so. So I think openness is the correct policy for the UK. You want to be able to make sure you can continue to get in imports and that other people treat you well, but forced onshoring is probably a policy that will not succeed.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. Turning back towards Rebecca, and a subject actually very close to the heart of myself, working at Global Trade Review, the issue of trade finance and trade across companies and their banks. Rebecca, turning back to you, we've seen huge pressure placed on SMEs and the banks tasked with financing them. I know you've written pieces on the choices governments are facing between health and the economy. How do you see the economic effects of the last few weeks and the forthcoming few months playing out when it comes to the practicalities of accessing financing for trade and the impact on trade policy?
I think it's we're living in super fascinating times, and as an economist I would say that, wouldn't I? Because just about every single economic model that we had of how to manage your economy has been thrown out of the window. We've got extraordinary monetary policy and extraordinary fiscal policy at the same time, which is amazing. The issue as that relates to trade and as that relates to small businesses is that the role of insurance, credit insurance in trade and supply chain management, and making sure that the SME sectors within that framework have enough money is absolutely critical. I'll just give you an example of the challenges that many exporters are facing of. And SMEs is anything. I mean, if you look at a bank definition, it's above 50 million. It could even go as high as 500 million in terms of a bank definition of an SME. So these are big exporters. They take very niche parts in supply chains. So you might find that there are very small niche medical equipment delivery companies that are, or supplier or distribution companies that are actually taking a critical part in that supply chain, but because there are problems around inventory stocks, because there are problems around non-deliverable contracts at the moment, and because there are issues around the extent to which contract deals are being shifted and moved, that places the SMEs who have a very key role in these supply chains, often very high value added, it pushes them into a very difficult position because they don't have the cash flow that larger organizations have, and they don't have the resources or the sort of war chest, if you like, that other organizations have. And what we're seeing in trade finance at the moment is the drop in the willingness of particularly private credit insurance companies, but credit insurance companies generally, to step in and insure those risks, because the risks have suddenly got very high indeed. And that risk might be a temporary one. We might have trade recover itself, but trade isn't going to be the same again. And so it's actually the responsibility within the framework of all of this borrowing that's going on. It's actually, I would argue, a responsibility of governments to step in and say, we need to make sure that those supply chains keep going. We need to make sure that the right resources get to the right players in the right part of the supply chain. And given against the backdrop of everything else that's happening, it's a really welcome step today, for example, that UKEF has stepped in to say, yes, we'll do whatever it takes to keep UK export finance going and insured, because SMEs within this sector are in a very difficult place, and that will damage global trade, because, as I said, there's a lot of research to say that these are companies that have very niche, very specific and very valuable, value-adding places in those global supply chains.
No, that's Definitely an interesting perspective, I think, when it comes to the role of, say, state cover versus, I guess, the private market as well. Do you think we're going to see new winners and losers based on this new situation when it comes to SMEs and larger companies? Do the bigger companies get bigger and the smaller companies dwindle? The comment about the UK being a nation of shopkeepers and SME market has been one that's been written, and across many global markets as well. Of course, this session is international, but do you see an aligning of that? Do you see sort of more larger companies swallowing up those smaller ones?
It's possible, but I think you also have to see, as Winnie was talking about earlier, you have so many companies doing so many different things. I mean, I talked about a node-based structure of inventory stock, so we have less inventory stock over more countries and more jurisdictions. And what we have actually, and more technology coming into all of this as well, is a specialism that's creeping in. So and also an interdependency. And this is essentially why we're not seeing the end of globalization. You have technology linking all of these businesses. You have interdependencies between all of these businesses. And so it's actually in the interest of the big suppliers, because very often these SMEs cater for something that they don't do themselves. It's on the periphery of what they might be doing. So it might be a layer of innovation or a layer of digitization or a layer, certainly in financial services, a fintech layer, or adding a non-bank element to things and so on, or adding KYC or AML that the banks themselves can't do. And what that means is that actually there's more of an ecosystem beginning to develop now. It might be that in the end that turns into some kind of huge consolidation, and we start to see the Keiretsu structure of the 1970s in Japan beginning to develop. But at the moment, I think keeping those whole set of things going is where the responsibility both of very large organizations which do have the facilities to be able to speed up supply chain finance, for example, through their own account trading. I actually think that we're in a position where at the moment there's no need for consolidation, but there probably will be after all of this is over, when everybody goes, hang on a minute, we could actually bring some of that functionality in-house. For example, the banks could say, we could bring some of that digital or fintech capability in-house now. And banks are developing these types of trade finance ecosystems in order to be able to potentially do that anyway. So I think we might see it on the financial side. I think whether or not we'll see it on the corporate side depends a lot on the role that those companies are playing and whether or not the companies themselves can do those jobs.
Presumably some of that also plays into some of the support packages and how they weren't necessarily suited to what you'd call higher growth companies that didn't have money in the bank, but were those startup fintechs that again in the UK they've been quite well known for.
Yeah, and I think the government has actually, I mean, in the UK, but across the world, governments have moved to try and help those R&D intensive companies that are very high growth. And I think it's a kind of understanding the demand side, understanding exactly what these SMEs do and why they need money, when often they're quite young, they're quite small, they're high growth, they're very innovative, and they need to do things in a way that's flexible, and they need to keep a lot of their R&D intensive side of things going. And there's been a lot of money in the UK in particular put into supporting R&D intensive firms. What we need to do is apply that similar type of support to exporting firms, because those ones are the ones that don't necessarily rely on that traditional type of finance. I need an overdraft or I need working capital. They often need invoice financing. And if they're below a certain threshold, then that's very difficult for them to get hold of. And that's where the gap is.
And I guess moving on to the next question, and this is one I'd like to bring Sam back in for as well as yourself, Rebecca. We've seen nation states take on enormous debts through various support programs, essentially underwriting the capitalist systems in many views. Would you expect to see more isolationist policies going forward? Rebecca, you've written extensively about the idea of trade being used as a tool of foreign policy. But now if governments feel they've bought the right to do so, are we going to see even more of this potentially?
as I said, I think I think we're going to see more nationalism. I think the interesting thing from a trade policy point of view, and Sam might differ to me on this, but I think from a trade policy point of view, what's really interesting now is the fact that the structures of the World Trade Organization and a lot of trade negotiations and trade deals assume a level playing field in terms of state aid. One of the gripes that everybody had, and the reason why there's been this sort of pressure on the World Trade Organization, has been because people were complaining about the amount of ostensibly state support to businesses and their export behaviours in China. And what's happened now is that actually a lot of those states have put money behind keeping their businesses shored up, keeping their business sectors shored up. So a lot of the rules around state aid have temporarily perhaps been thrown out of the window. I think there's a second very important question, though, which I was hinting at earlier, which is how, in terms of recovery, we start to manage that level of debt. Now, is this a question of states taking over these businesses, assuming control of them, or, and I would suggest this one is more likely, a kind of Marshall Plan type structure where everything just gets paid off over the long term, because it's the only way of subsuming all of that debt. Because in the end, certainly in the developed world, the market-based capitalist world, the state would not want ideologically to have that degree of control over businesses. They'd want to keep them trading independently.
And Sam, do you perhaps want to come in on that as well?
Just building on that point slightly, in terms of how this plays out, one of the things to consider from COVID-19 in the response is the differing capacity of states to prop up their businesses and what the impact of that will be. If you think in terms of, even within Europe, if you think Germany, the UK, France can just pour loads of money at their companies, but Greece, less so. Portugal, a bit more of a struggle. And the problem you have there in terms of fragmentation, I suppose, is even within Europe, you have an asymmetric recovery, not even taking into account the differing impacts of when they're actually having the lockdowns and when they come out of the lockdown, when the second wave hits, when it doesn't. There's an issue there. And then you get onto questions of debt sustainability, because to be honest, none of this is probably going to be ever really paid off. It's just, the question is can you afford to service the debt? Do you reduce it over time relative to GDP? And how do you do that? You grow. Your economy grows. And if you have this problem where essentially the already indebted, struggling countries are struggling to grow as a result of this, then their debt becomes more of a problem, because potentially it becomes more expensive for them to borrow in the future and over time, and their borrowing costs go up. So you do, I'm just talking about this in the context of Europe, but you can see how this could also expand far and wide. And I think you do have a problem there. In terms of isolationist policies, a lot rides on the US and what happens this year, I think, in terms of the election. And I'm not saying that a Biden victory suddenly means the US rows back on everything it's been doing. It won't, especially in terms of how it interacts with China. I think the Democrats might even in some areas be more critical of China than Trump. But in terms of the idea that problems can be solved internationally via dialogue rather than via a stick, I think there is a
tweet.
There's yes, exactly, via tweets. Yes, there is a big difference, and as to questions. So, with the sustainability of the World Trade Organization, Director General announced today that he's going to be stepping down a year earlier than he intended. Will there ever be a replacement? Under Trump, that is a very big open question. Under Biden, you'd assume there would be. So these things do matter, and what happens in US politics matters. And for the UK, it's going to be a question of whether it can navigate all of this, because with Brexit, I would say that if you think of us as a boat, we've gained the ability to choose to travel in whatever direction we like, but we have lost some of our ability to control the tides. So we're going to be getting buffeted around a bit. And actually managing that is a big challenge for the government going forward.
Thank you both. Yeah, as promised, we're monitoring various questions coming in, so we'll get into those shortly. Before we do that, though, can I please ask our technical friends to load up our final polling question for those watching to vote on? I did see that the first question, we got to 87% in terms of a change in the role of China. So I think that's pretty much unanimous. The second polling question, which hopefully is going to be loaded now, people to see it, will trade become more or less political in the era of COVID-19? Once again, the options are yes, no, and hard to predict, which I think people should really try to predict, if I'm honest. But we're going to park that question there and come back to it towards the end of this session. We're now moving into our Q&A part, and pleased to bring Winnie back in here. Winnie, just looking at the questions submitted, this is a good one to get started with. As we know, governments have taken on massive levels of additional debt to prop up their economies. As they seek to recoup this, do you foresee a greater tax burden and increased pressure on the Treasury function? I suspect I know the answer to this, but how will this impact on things like cash forecasting and more broadly the role of the Treasurer?
Yeah, indeed, this is a very good question. I think they also indicated the changing environment we are working in. Treasurers, we are very much used to dealing with uncertainties. However, given the non-precedented issues we're all observing, feels like the game rules has to keep, being, breaking up, and then everything is actually open for rediscussion and renegotiation. So the relevant, implications and impact for different government, different, governments, P&L might be different. So then the reaction for different governments may differ. So then actually that might, provide different alternative to what we seek as a norm, really. Being the treasurer of the company, I think the main thing is that we need to work with the internal, external experts and really, truly, keep on, on the hot seat in terms of knowing what's happening in different countries and what's the risk and what's the new policies and what is actually impacting to your organization. And then trying to be very adaptable in terms of change and tuning, finding your policies and facilitate any potential, outcome of the changes and then how that impacts your organization. So one thing very much true that for most of the board of directors actually have increasing focus on cash forecast. And PPD is not alone there. And we actually discussing cash forecasts constantly on pretty much a daily, hourly with various different senior management team and board directors. So what I find is really helpful is actually thinking about what's your baseline business and what is your norm, and utilize your normal norm, produce a baseline forecast, then come up with a lot of different assumptions. And whether, say, if the tax rate were going up in UK, this rate, and in India, that rate, so on and so forth, come up with as many assumptions that you can think of, and then actually go extreme, provide a version of a cash forecast, and then actually apply different sets of assumptions for different cash forecasts. So literally, the cash forecast process we have, apart from doing our normal cash forecast, we come up with different versions, applying for different assumptions, different scenarios, and then come up with various different, versions of cash forecasts, and to help the company to formulate, strategies, and also think about if this happens, we already thought about it and how we're going to prepare to deal with that. And then obviously we don't have a crystal balls in front of us. We don't know which government is going to do what in different countries. We don't know whether inflation rate will increase. We don't know whether tax rate will raise to a certain extent, but we can prepare by, making sure you actually go back to the question before, is actually, provide and build sufficient cash reserve in your company to actually deal with all the eventualities. Saying that all of that, I think, one thing is actually, and you bring back to home, is actually during this pandemic, we also see the other side of things. We find, all of us probably find, working from home is actually not the end of the world. In fact, we are business still going, and then so lots of people already, certainly, everyone's discussing this point, saying your normal cost, for example, for facilities, for travel, so on and so forth. And maybe that's an opportunity to think about something different. The normal cost might be reduced in a certain way. So I think this is a really good question for all of us, really, for the Treasury to think about what is norm post-pandemic. What, what is the negative side, and what potentially the positive side for your organization? I hope that answered the question.
It does. Thank you so much, Winnie. Coming to some other questions, there's a chance for people to vote on what they feel is the best questions submitted. So the most popular question so far actually concerns the Middle East. So the Middle East are dealing with the joint crisis of the decline of oil prices as well as the impact of COVID-19. How do we see trade in the region being affected? Rebecca, you've done quite a bit of work in the Middle East region. Perhaps you might want to go first on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it depends whether you're talking economically or in terms of business diversification away from oil, all sorts. The Middle East at the moment is will be having an absolute nightmare because trade in the Middle East is over 90% correlated with the price of oil. So we tend to see a drop in trade, just simply statistically, it has to drop in value terms because the price has gone down. So that means that the exchequers across the region end up with less money. We haven't worked through the full effects of the economic crisis between 2014 and 2016 when oil prices collapsed. The economic reforms that were necessary in the Middle East to be able to grow those economies and make them sustainable and make them independent of the oil price haven't fully worked through. Some countries have done better than others. You've got a range of difficulties in the Middle East. It's increasingly becoming a sort of east-west fault line as well in trade terms between the Belt and Road coming in one direction and waning US influence in the other direction. We've seen for a number of years now physical trade in oil and gas moving increasingly towards Russia and China. That's important, and strategically the region is split down the middle as well, so on sectarian grounds. So it's a bit of a melting pot at the moment, and a lot of this is going to come down to the maturity of the regimes in the region to be able to say, now is the time to use any resources we have to promote diversification, because having this type of dependency on the oil price that absolutely wipes out the economies if they can't survive that drop in revenues into their exchequers, that sort of broadening out and diversification is very important. I would say one thing though, that the region is a trade hub. And so it is ports. It is a route through from Europe through to sub-Saharan Africa and then on to China. It has an incredibly important role as actually almost a distribution center in its own right, a trade hub in its own right. That will be something that will come into play as well as trade begins to pick up. That role is something to push. So it's not all bleak. We will see reconstruction and development like everywhere else in the world. We will see perhaps closer relationships with sub-Saharan Africa, because sub-Saharan Africa is also very commodity price dependent. We might see that fueling more intra-African trade, importance of soft commodities, importance of supply chains. The other thing is, just to end, the Middle East is actually a really big consumer of medical equipment and medical products in trade terms. So there's also an opportunity for that to become a part of the specialist distribution between Europe and the rest of the world as well through the region. So there are opportunities. SMEs are important, innovation is important, but it's that diversification thing that's going to drive the economy, I think, going forward.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm being nudged virtually to say that we've only got a couple of minutes left. So my final question is for Sam. And you haven't got long, unfortunately, Sam, but will policymakers introduce more constraints to ensure that countries are not reliant on imports from a single country like China, and making diversification of imports a regulatory requirement?
I think there will be some of that. We've already seen it happen partially, say, in Japan. We're not on the regulatory side, but on the funding side, the government has made a pot of money available to companies who want to diversify their supply chain out of China. It was badly reported in the English press, in that it was reported that this applied to everything. It actually applies quite narrowly to essentially sensitive goods and medical products that are deemed to be very, very important. There hasn't been a huge take-up of it so far, so we'll see how we go. And I can just see on the second question, it says, how can international bodies and governments across the world work together to prevent another pandemic? The question isn't how, we know how. It's no export restrictions, it's keeping tariffs slashed where they've slashed them, it's money for the poor, money and equipment for the poorest countries, greater regulatory cooperation, particularly on issues around mutual recognition of good manufacturing practices. The question is, will they? And as going back to my answer to the previous question, I think a lot is riding on what the US does on the big macro scale. Will there be pockets of countries that continue to cooperate even in the absence of the US? Of course, we can see New Zealand and Singapore with initiatives, putting forward initiatives to do this, but it won't be as effective.
Thanks, Sam. I think we're just going to come back to our final polling question. And again, I can probably guess the answers. Will trade become more or less political in the era of COVID-19? It was yes, no, or hard to predict. So for this one, we had 8.7% say it was difficult to predict. So people, again, sitting on the fence in some instances, but a whopping 87% again saying that trade will become more political, very much reflecting the viewpoints put across by some of our speakers here. That does bring this session to a close. Many thanks to our speakers, to Rebecca, to Winnie and to Sam, and indeed for you, our audience, for participating and putting in your questions. I think we can agree there's a lot of things to consider, much food for thought in the world of trade, and for those treasurers watching to consider. I believe there's still one more live session taking place in around 30 minutes time, a high-level group looking at the key takeaways for treasurers from this week and essential points for business recovery, whilst all the sessions from this week are either already up on the platform or will be soon. But in the meantime, thank you all very much for joining us, and do take care.
Thank you.